Mr. Jimmy Panetta for 5 minutes.
Outstanding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And thanks for all your testimony today, gentlemen and lady. I appreciate this because what you got to realize is not many other people on the Hill in Washington, D.C. are talking about this issue. I mean, when it came down and what we saw the last election, there were just sporadic mentions by the major party presidential candidates, let alone a serious plan to address it. And as I say it and I sum it up, debt, literally and figuratively, is a 4-letter word. So thank you for being here. And thanks to the chairman and ranking member for having this type of hearing in which we're actually talking about it. But what we got to realize that the discussion cannot be confined to this room. It has to be done outside of this room, outside of Congress, and yes, throughout the United States of America. But it does start here, so I appreciate that. And as we know, as we go into the 118th Congress, I'm glad that we're taking the time to examine the fiscal situation of our nation, which by all accounts, as we've heard, is getting worse. Now, as you have mentioned, the national debt has reached a staggering $36.1 trillion, and the deficit is now at $257 billion. Simply stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio at 97% of GDP would require a $7.9 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years. And reducing the debt to GDP ratio to pre-pandemic levels would require $15 trillion in 10-year savings. These are sums, and it's an issue that is going to affect our future. And one day, bond investors may look at our government and say they won't get paid back. That's what's going to lead to higher interest rates. And that could restrain our economic growth, and it could crowd out our priorities and potentially impair for our ability to borrow, either in war or at another crisis. And beyond the downgrades to the U.S. credit rating and lackluster demand for Treasury debt at some auctions, 2 of 3 major credit ratings, as I said, companies downgraded the U.S. because of our dysfunctional politics. What we got to realize is that one day the U.S. is going to find it very, very difficult to keep borrowing money. And one day the interest costs will constrain us. And guess what? That's when the money we have now to pay for these programs that we've talked about, that I agree with, as a proud Democrat, that's when we're no longer going to have the money to pay for those programs if we don't do anything now. That's why tackling the issue requires both parties to seriously consider trade-offs to address revenues and spending. And make no mistake, both parties share responsibility for this problem. Despite what candidate Trump said in 2016 that it would pay off the national debt in 8 years, the national debt grew under him by $8.18 trillion. It grew by $7 trillion under the Biden administration. And over the 2 terms of the Obama administration, it added $8.3 trillion to the debt, and the Bush administration added $6.1 billion. So each year, the longer we wait to act, the solutions available become more extreme and less palatable. And we know that this is a serious problem. And as each of you have pointed out, these are going to be serious implications for the long-term health of our economy and worse, for the future of our democracy. Now, one of the barriers to action on debt is that so many proposed solutions are just politically unpopular. My Republican colleagues don't want to raise revenues, and many of my colleagues on my side of the aisle are resistant to even examining spending. However, I worry, as we've heard today, that the longer we take, the more extreme steps must be taken to manage the debt. Mr. Elmendorf, what steps would need to be taken to stabilize debt to GDP ratio at a healthy range, even now?
Well, Congressman, thank you for the question. To stabilize debt at about 100% of GDP, where it stands today, we would need to reduce the annual deficits by about $600 billion relative to current law. And as I say, if one wants to extend the expiring tax provisions, one needs to make up for that. Then additionally, if one wanted to bring debt back down as a share of GDP to the areas that we were more familiar with before, then you need to do even more than that. But even $600 billion a year would be a tremendous change, a tremendously large change to make in spending and tax policies.
And quickly, Mr. Walker, I was one of 3 Democrats that voted for the fiscal commission on this budget committee when he passed it out of here, which I think is a responsible way to proceed. What would you say in response to those that actually oppose the fiscal commission on process grounds?
Well, as is mentioned, some people say, well, that's your job and therefore you should do it. And the problem is the track record speaks loudly. Things have gotten much, much worse. It's a bipartisan problem. You know, I've done citizen education engagement, including some with your dad, okay, in 47 states, 2 territories, and several countries. The people are way ahead of the politicians. They're focused on debt to GDP, revenue to GDP, spending to GDP. I got 77 to 97% support for specific reforms in all the areas we've talked about and more that would stabilize debt to GDP at a lower level than we are now, which is what we need to do, okay? And so I think my question is it, you know, if not now, when? If not us, who? So I commend you for supporting that. We need that commission desperately. That can help us make much bigger changes than DOGE will ever make, although I support DOGE. But understand this, even if you do that, and you're gonna have to do it to make these tough choices with trade-offs. Secondly, you gotta have a constitutional amendment to be able to maintain discipline over time. The debt ceiling's a bad joke. You know, it totally failed. And statutory approaches like Graham-Rudman or whatever, they don't stand the test of time. Only a constitutional amendment can bind current and future Congresses. Thank you, sir.
Thank you again, witness.